Today I want to talk about splice tip match rods. It's a type of match rod that is increasingly rare, and the reason I'm talking about it is because someone was looking at one of my other videos about influencers on match rods and said about getting an updated match rod for fishing a stick float. And the standard stick float rod, if you like, is a 13-foot rod, fairly tippy, with a nice light action, and something that is balanced to fine lines and small hooks. Lots of people do trot floats and use relatively big hooks. Sometimes I do, fishing 14s and 12s and so on, and 3 and 4 pound line. But the sort of traditional stick float fishing that evolved on the Trent back in the 70s and the 80s was all around people fishing with main lines of sort of Bayer 1.7, hook lengths of Bayer 1.1, and down to even sort of 12-ounce Bayer and even 8-ounce Bayer, and small hooks as well. A 20 was almost a big hook. 22s were sort of standard, and a few top anglers were fishing with 24s. People like John Allerton was fishing 24s and 8-ounce bottoms. So you needed a very forgiving rod, and yet you wanted that delicacy of touch to be able to just control the float perfectly and set the hook with just the slightest of movements, not some great big sweeping strike that you could get away with the big hooks and the strong line, or the sort of style of fishing that when you start to fish a waggler further out and you've got a big bow in the line, maybe because of a downstream wind, you need a different action. You need to pick up all that line and set, even though again a fairly small hook, without cracking off, and absorb the fish. And of course, on a river like the Trent and my own local river, the Stour, the Frome, the Avon, the water can be quite pacey as well. So you've got a current that's going anything up to maybe even 4 or 5 miles an hour, and you're looking to hook roach. That could be big roach, sizable roach. And roach takes some landing on fine gear in those sort of conditions. So you've got a light line, small hook, fine wire hook, and you want that rod, like I say, to strike gently, but to bring the fish in without pulling the hook out, straightening the hook, bumping the fish. And this sort of challenge was there from the 70s when we were still on fiberglass rods. People started to splice tips into fiberglass rods. We had the Shakespeare International, I think, had a splice tip. And then when we went into carbon, around about 1978-ish, there were carbon match rods before that, but carbon match rods really took off in about 1978. Just about everyone who was match fishing had a carbon rod by 79 or 80. And people quickly found that they were much lighter. They only weighed 6 to 7 ounces instead of anything from 9 or 10 ounces up to nearly a pound. Some ridiculous. That old Abu Mark 6 weighs 14 3/4 ounces. It's a forgiving rod. Don't knock it. I've caught plenty of fish, and so did thousands of others, caught lots of fish on them. But they found the tips were a bit too fierce, the hollow tips. It was hard to get a finer tip in carbon. So the answer was people started to experiment, people like John Dean and plenty of others, experiment with solid carbon tips, very fine tips, tapered and spigoted into halfway down the top section. And of course that brings its own problems of trying to avoid having a flat spot where it actually meets, where the two materials meet up, getting the blend of the bend. But that solid carbon tip gives that bit more finesse, and that you can just do that little touch on it. The problem is now that, for a start, match rods are mostly out of fashion. The biggest selling match rods by far, I should imagine, and I'd be surprised if this is wrong at the moment, are Drennan acolytes, which are probably reasonably priced. If we put it at a price point of sort of £180, £200 thereabouts, if you compare what people like myself paid for the phenomenal Normark 2000 series rods back in over 30 years ago, 1991, I paid £240 for a Titan 2000 when the RRP was 340 or 350, so about £100 off. But that 240, if you put it into one of these inflation calculators, you'll get a figure way over £200. It'll be more like, I don't know, without checking it out, but we call it £400 or £500. So an expensive rod, and that's the sort of price. The most expensive match rods are still up for sale. Some of the top of range Daiwa ones, the full price is over £500. So they were top of the range then. So the Drennans are very much a mid-price point. There are much cheaper match rods. You can go right down to sort of 40 or 50 quid. You're not going to get a really good splice tip match rod for that money. So, like I say, the Drennans are the sort of common rod, the one that people are buying. And they've got one tremendous selling point. They are very, very light. They weigh very, very little. They are perceived, and I say perceived, as fragile. And they're not what you would call a stick float rod. You can fish a stick float rod with them, but they're a bit soft, a bit slow compared to the best stick float rods. And this is the problem. There are virtually no stick float rods up for sale now. The Tricast Allerton Premier Match that I've got, I got that 8 years ago in 2017. It had been out a while then. It's got a splice tip. It's got a screw up reel fitting, which plenty of people have implored Tricast to change to a screw down one. They're not listening to that. I've changed my rod. Other people of my acquaintance have done the same. It makes it a far better rod, and it is a phenomenal rod. And that one's price point, its RRP is about 280. If you can get one, not many people stock it. You have to get a tackle dealer to order it. And we're talking a 13-foot rod. By the time you've added a screw down reel fitting, taken the eyes off the rod, hacked off the existing one, put on a new Fuji fitting, which are about £18 each plus postage, and re-whip the eyes on. And if you can get someone to do that for you, good luck. But you've added 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds to the price. You'll need some cork as well to get rid of the duplon on the handle. You end up with a fantastic rod, far better than the acolytes. It's not as light, but the action is much, much better. And if I was going to be ultra critical, I'd probably give it 9 out of 10 on action. It will handle big fish, it will handle light lines. It's got that perfect match of action, lightness, usability, pleasure to fish with, and I don't regret what I did to my rod to make it spot on, absolutely spot on. But you shouldn't really have to do that to a brand new rod. I waited about 5 years or whatever it was before I took the Procon, which is like a Dremel, to the reel fitting and broke it off there. Brutal, but worth it. One or two other people have brought out fantastic stick float rods in the last few years. Browning, who no longer exist as a manufacturer, their brand has been taken over. They won't be called Browning, but they're under a different group. Brought out the Sphere, and they had a 13'6" river rod with a splice tip, very light. That had a quite a different sort of, almost you call it a skeleton handle, a bit of a Marmite handle again. I've had a very brief fish with one. It is a wonderfully light rod, very, very good action. I haven't caught any, so I had a very quick couple of casts and trots with one. I haven't caught any fish with it to say just what it would be like to catch lots of fish. Whereas my Tricast rod, I've had bags and bags of roach and chub and dace, grayling, all the rest of it. And I know what it can and can't do. I've had double figure pike on it, of all things. I think that Browning rod was fantastic. They were, even when they were sort of discounted in the final knock-ins, they were well over £400. They are now like hen's teeth. You would have to be extremely lucky to find one. Extremely lucky. Daiwa are still making some top class match rods, and in the past they've made lots of splice tip rods, carbon rods, starting with the sort of Connoiseurs, their match winner, Spectron and Spectron 2, probably a load of others. The earliest ones, like the Connoiseur, go way back to the 80s, and they're still using the name Connoiseur. So there were over, talking what, 35 years, more than 35 years, a number of different rods with Connoiseur on, some of which, or a few of which, and they were always the special rod, the splice tip rod, whereas the majority weren't splice tip, had splice tips. Something like the Spectron 2, again, if you could find it, would be a tremendous choice as a stick float rod. Can you find one? Eventually, maybe. The Amorphous, there was an Amorphous whisker and an Amorphous match, I think, and there was I had the cheaper, I've still got the cheaper one, I can't remember which one it is, and it was about £165, but there was the other one, which was 2 inches longer, also a splice tip, and it was about £265, and they were both light tippy rods, very much Tommy Pickering design, who he liked these very fine tip rods for the Trent, for fishing a stick float, perfect for the job. I don't think they have screw down reel fittings, so you have to put up with the old sliding reel fittings. They do have arm lock handles, which is common with the topper range Daiwa rods, the made in Scotland ones. Definitely worth looking for. Shakespeare made enormous numbers of match rods, especially back in the 80s and 90s. If you can find a catalogue from the sort of 90s, you'll find match rod range after match rod range, with sort of £10 in between them, and by the time you get to the 140 quid rods in the early 90s, so they're, by today's standard, a 300 quid rod, you'll find, I think, like the Excelsior, there was one, and Match Area also, with splice tips, slim rods, light, tippy, designed for proper stick float fishing. There was one I saw the other day, trying to think what it was called, Victor or Victor X or something, that had two tips. It had a splice tip and a hollow tip. And if you can find these rods there and you like them, then you may find the perfect stick float rod. but again, it's not going to have a screw down fitting. And they're more recent ones. They went to the hollow tips. There are some other rods that are tippy, like a stick float rod, but hollow tipped, like the Team Daiwa X, which dates to the late 90s. That was a £300 rod then, so call it £500 now. Fine tip, very nice rod, very forgiving, and hidden power. This rod that I've got belonged to a mate of mine who died in 2002, and I can remember watching him fish with it and thinking, is this really a good river rod and all the rest of it? And then he went and caught a £17 carp in a match and beat me into second place, and he got that on a 20 hook and a fine line, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And since then I've used that, having inherited the rod. I've had carp to £23 on fine gear, £2 line, quite a few doubles, including a couple of doubles one evening on the Dorset Froome, fishing a stick float. And it beats huge great fish, but you can sit and catch dace and roach all day long with it. It's one of those hidden gems. It's got a tournament reel fitting, which was okay. I didn't get on with it in the end. That's been replaced with a more standard Fuji reel fitting in my case, but it's nicer to fish with now. It's more comfortable because I put a cork hood on it as well. The one I've got, like I said, it's a bit battle scarred, and knowing that my mate liked his rods to look immaculate, he'd probably be, I don't know what here you go. Horrible, what have you done to it? But what a fantastic rod and a good stick float rod. The little bit of news that is wait and see. I don't know what's exactly going to happen, but the word is that the Normark name is returning as far as match rods are concerned. They probably, or almost certainly, won't be made in the original Japanese factory. However, the word is that the equivalents of the old Titan 2000 and so on as brand new rods, hopefully a bit lighter, almost certainly a bit more robust. And the only weakness on those 2000 and the previous Titans and Avengers was that last inch or two of the tip. It's very common to find a 2000 series rod with the last half an inch or inch breaking off right at the joint of the tip ring. People taking out the bit of carbon out of the tip ring and gluing it back on again. And several of my Normarks are like that. It doesn't make an awful lot of difference, but people like them in mint condition. But that was their real weakness, if you like, and that's been addressed. So when they're going to hit the shops, I don't know. Hopefully next spring, we shall see. But certainly the action of the original Avenger 2000, it's a rod that's plenty of power further down, but a wonderful action. So it's tippy. You can sit and catch dace on it all day long on a stick float, and then hit a big chub or something like that, and it will just absorb it. I've had chub over £6 on mine, tench over £6, mullet over £6, barbel, pulled them out of great big snags on the Hampshire Avon up to about £7, and they've gone right in the snags, and they just pulled them all the way out again. Double figure carp, and that's just off the top of my head. So that's not a splice tip rod. It'll be interesting to see what those rods are like, how much they go for. Do I need one? Probably not. But it's always good to it's good to see that there's something on the horizon. As for other brands, I've never come across any really fantastic stick float rods. Preston makes some very good match rods. Maver have done the same, a few others. And again, it's finding them. I've got a Colmic Extrema 15 foot. I thought about the 13 foot. I've got loads of 13 foot match rods, all very good ones. I thought it'd be nice to have a really light 15 foot rod, which is what it is. It's not tippy like a stick float rod, but it's a crisp action. It's not a slow action or floppy or anything like that. And it's got an arm lock type handle because that's out of patent. So Daiwa can't stop people doing that. They can't call it an arm lock, but that's what it is. The only thing on the Colmic rods is that the ringing on the butt joint, it needs more rings. In Italy, there's very little wind where they fish, and they tend to have widely spaced rings on the butt joint, and so there's a big gap between the butt ring and the reel. And in our much windier weather, the line flaps around all over the place, and you think, it needs someone to look at this and re-ring about the bottom 5 eyes to get the spacing right for English style fishing. But if anyone from Colmic's listening, you can do better. For the cost of 1 or 2 eyes, it would be a lot better for our style of fishing. And if you ever look at a rod like my original John Dean match rod, and you see how many eyes there are on that, there's 3 eyes on the butt section, and they start quite close to the reel. People like John Dean and John Allerton, they really like those lots of eyes on the rod to get the line flowing exactly right. That's it for this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. I do hope to get out on the bank fairly soon because the weather has been atrocious. We've had gales, floods, more floods, more floods, more floods, snow, yet more floods, gales. It's half light out there in mid-December, a freezing cold wind. The river is settling and I haven't got much chance to get out there, but hopefully fairly soon. And until next time, it's goodbye for now.